um, so Kant would say when we're in the mode or we're in the state of consciousness that he wanted to call reason, Vernunft, the point of view of Vernunft, where again, it's most obvious in the moral philosophy, when we see each other as moral agents who deserve respect, and that I have an ethical responsibility to advance the autonomy of you, and you have the ethical responsibility to do the same to me. He wanted to say that at that level, there aren't concepts any longer. There are ideas, and that ideas are no longer constitutive of empirical reality. So when I aspire to create a democratic world in which, and I actually work towards it, in which people are treated with dignity and respect, and our autonomy is actually, built into our laws, that doesn't mean like that the world is actually that way. There's a kind of like teleological or an eschatological, like, well, maybe we'll someday get to the state where our ideas of freedom and democratic equality and moral respect could be attained, but we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Hegel move is to say, no, the concepts at the higher cognitive order are actually constitutive of the world, that there isn't, like we don't have to wait for democracy. We don't have to wait for, or we don't have to wait for our concept of democracy to be constitutive of reality, even if like it hasn't yet been like, it's actualized in a certain way. I mean, this depends on a certain reading of history, which we can talk about. But
Mm-hmm.
so like Kant was willing to kind of let higher order cognitive operations have a certain epistemological content, but he just undermined the the um, the determinacy of those higher order concepts. Whereas Hegel wants to say no, high order concepts are actually constitutive of reality. They are actual. They might not be realized, but they are still actual. We might not have realized democracy and a post-gender, post-racial world, but they're actual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's got like I'm sympathetic to this line. If democracy isn't actual, then we wouldn't conceptualize it. We wouldn't have a concept of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we have to wait to see what a true democracy looks like, then we don't have a concept of democracy. And I think that's the Hegelian move, is to say, like, if I don't know what gender equality is, like if I have to be like, well, I have to wait and see what gender equality is like, then I don't have a concept of it. Then like that doesn't mean it's actually realized in the empirical world.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is the mistake Kant's making from Hegel's perspective, is like, if you're saying we have an idea of the moral law, then we have the idea of the moral law. We don't have to wait and see what the manifestation of the moral law will look like, or what it's not going to surprise us
Mm-hmm.
down the road what true human equality or freedom looks like. We either have that concept or we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't have it, then it's in the domain of like opinion or some other kind of lower order discursive kind of form. But if we actually have the concept of democracy, then we have it. And like if history hasn't caught up to it, so much the worse for human history. I don't know if you can follow that thought process. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like I feel like one of the significant gripes and what you're getting at between Hegel and Kant seems to be that, Hegel is concerned to show that like practical cognition works in a similar manner as theoretical cognition, and that they're mutually sort of intricated, that they form sort of two parts of what he'll call spirit, right? And that sort of like by partaking in the labor of elaborating these different modes of cognizing the world, you actually do like have a history, and that's how we play
Right.
a role in shaping history. And it seems like Kant's sort of like language of regulative ideals don't do enough justice to our practices in shaping and revising the world and our role in it, and as well as our conception of the world.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean that's certainly Hegel's perspective, and I mean that's the deontological complaint that's always made against Kant, that because he severed the theoretical and the practical,
Mm-hmm.
always with the mind of putting them back together. But in that initial severing, there was no way for the theoretical and the practical to like synthesize again,
Hmm.
despite his work in the third critique, to put them back together again. I think that is the standing German idealist complaint, is that like, if you have to step back to make sense of your kind of moral or political bearing in the world, then
Hmm.
there's no way really to kind of re-engage the concepts that you come up with once you re-engage the world. That they have, like in order for them to be real practical concepts or real moral concepts, they have to be operative always already in the practical domain. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I,
So the concept that, like the concept of democracy that you have with you already, like, is that the spirit technically? Like that, like the reality that you carry with you into the future?
right. I think that's right. And so when we disagree about what, um, just one of the topics that comes up in democratic theory is some question about representation versus non-representation, or how to translate representative government into a democratic form. So those arguments are possible only because we have the concept of democracy, or maybe the debate about the electoral college in the United States, that like how functional is it, what is it doing, does it protect democracy, does it advance democracy, is there some way in which like minority perspectives are protected by the electoral college, are they not? All of that conversation that we have when we had meaningful political conversations back in the before times, from Hegel's perspective, he would say we can't have those arguments and disagreements if we didn't already have the concept of democracy. And in having those conversations, we realize our concept of democracy more fully. We enact it. We build it into our practical engagement with the world. So there's no kind of like waiting to discover the concept of democracy, because we couldn't have a conversation about democracy if we didn't always already have the concept,
Hmm.
at least implicitly in this kind of spirit form. Yeah.
Hmm. And I
Yeah.
wanted to comment on something you said about the split between the theoretical and practical cognition, because the lecture that I posted, Gabriel actually pulls a quote from Hegel, and he mentions, it sounds kind of Nietzschean, but basically the quote is like, on Kant's view, we sort of just happen to pull a bunch of faculties out of our soul sack, and reason just happens to be in there. And Hegel thinks that sort of like just looking inside your soul and kind of like finding all of these faculties already there kind of misses the active role we play in putting into action these faculties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And this is Hegel's criticism too of Kant's claims about the a priori concepts of the understanding, that though Kant in the first critique claims that they are a complete system of all possible a priori concepts of experience, basically, of the metaphysics of experience, because they're grounded in logic. Hegel felt the same way, that Kant just kind of reached into a bag, a kind of Aristotelian logical bag, and pulled out 12 and was like, yep, that's all there are. There are no more in there. And Hegel found this very unsatisfying.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the question is something like, I take it that one of the so two, just to talk about modal logic for a second, because why not? So two of the arguments between Kant and to some extent the modern philosophical tradition and then Hegel, surround modal logic, and that is the relationship between the kind of possible and the actual, and then the necessary. And so I take it that Kant, well, I don't take it that Kant said that he has supplied the conditions for the possibility of experience. And then Chris, you brought this up with transcendental argumentation. He didn't have to like argue for the next step, because clearly experience is actual. Like, voila, like look at your hand, like look in the mirror, like look around you. Experience is actual. And so the gap between possibility and actuality for Kant was covered by the field of experience. So if he could lay out the conditions for the possibility of experience, the last kind of like thin distance between possible experience and actual experience was covered by the actuality of experience. Like it was, there's that kind of G.E. Moore, or like just this kind of like empiricist, like are you skeptical about reality? Like, put your hand to your face and you'll stop being skeptical. Like something of that, like, empirical dogmatism in Kant's philosophy that I mean, I think is interesting, given he's a continental European thinker, but really adopted that British empiricist, like, duh, the world, but for Hegel, he didn't want to leave the, like, gap between possibility and actuality to kind of be solved by something other than a philosophical, truly systematic unfolding of experience. And so it's always the conditions of the actuality of something. It's never like the possible disappears in Hegel. And I think I tried to get to that at one point, talking about kind of like experience always, like, just, is the way it is. And so that's one thing to notice, is that the emphasis that Kant put on possibility, Hegel just displaces with actuality. And that enables him then to move to necessity quite easily, that the unfolding of the phenomenology, even though we can get lost in the weeds of the argument, ostensibly every step that the text takes is a necessary step. There's no false step here, that, sense certainty had to give way to perception, and perception had to give way to understanding. And then, PJ, where you and I started talking, understanding and the play of forces has to give way to self-consciousness. There's no contingency to this unfolding of the modes of consciousness, or stages of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Hegelian insight is something like, if you begin in the domain of possibility, then you have to kind of like sneak necessity back in and be like, oh yeah, this is all the concepts we have, like, and okay, justify that to me, Kant. Well, I can't really, or logic, consciousness. Oh, well, logic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Hegel would be like, well, that's the mistake you make when you begin with what is merely possible. Rather, I'll begin with what is actual. And so necessity follows modally, in modal logic, from actuality.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit, fancier than we need to do, but that's always helped me reading Hegel, was kind of to think about him not in terms of like, well, this is one possible thing that could have happened, or who knows what's going to come. I mean, this is all systematically actual and necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just did a cursory sort of like Google of Hegel and modality, and there's looks like there's an essay from Paul Redding on Findley's Hegel as a construal of Hegel committed to modal actualism, where sort of, I guess, possibility would be physically sort of encoded into the fabric of reality, which would be interesting. But yeah, that's just a possible article.
If you want to save possibility
Mm-hmm.
in Hegel's philosophy, because it, like, he's a good logician in that old-fashioned sense, kind of pre-Frege sense. You just put it between the actual and the realized, like, so, back to Reagan, your question. So we have an actual concept of democratic equality. It's not necessarily realized yet. So but that doesn't mean it's not actual, the concept. It just means that its realization kind of is yet to happen in, like in history or under given circumstances. And so the possible could kind of come in at that level of the relationship between actualization and the actual and the realized. And then one way to read this text, which is, I read it this way, and I brought this up once before, is that we don't really get anywhere. Sense certainty is still in hand at the very end of the text, and he brings up sense certainty in the last paragraphs of the phenomenology, not to ruin the book for you. But he basically says, like, we already had all of this in sense certainty. But of course we did, because it has to be a closed system in order for it to be truly systematic. Mm-hmm. So where's the progress? Where's the change? And maybe the change is between the actual and the real, rather than the kind of possible becoming actual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What was the necessary?
What is that?
Didn't you say that there's like the possible, the actual, and the necessary?
Those are the three standard modal logical categories.
Okay.
So Kant does work to kind of link them to one another. And I just take it that Hegel's kind of subtle, not so subtle critique is just to say, you'll never get to the necessary if you begin with the possible. and I think we see this a little bit when we watch understanding here or self-consciousness break down and become reason toward the end of the this reading for today, is that reason, or on the threshold of reason, understanding starts to grasp something that's just kind of utterly like truly absolute, and that, like, I mean, I tend to read these last sections of the Truth of Self-Certainty, or sorry, the Freedom of Self-Consciousness section as kind of quasi-religious, that some of the stuff about, the three modes are kind of like the God, sorry, I'm not very religious, God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit, like that there's a kind of theological mapping here, because understanding is coming up against something that's like truly truly universal, truly, like it's on the threshold of grasping necessity. And I'm going to phrase it this way and just show that I don't understand Hegel, basically. But if there's a God, and Hegel would just be like, there is, like, you don't understand. You're poor unhappy consciousness when you say if there's a God, like. But I'm stuck in unhappy consciousness. That's fine. I know where I stop. But like, so like, if there's a God, that God is is necessary, is absolute. There's no, it's even beyond the infinitude with which self-consciousness begins, because our first kind of grasp of the absolute is here at the end of unhappy consciousness, where kind of consciousness faces something like a God, or or a kind of metaphysical reality that's just absolute. But again, the pithy way to say that is something like, you would never get there. Like, I'm never going to be a believer if I begin every sentence with if there's a God. Like, I'll never grasp the concept of God if every one of my sentences begins with, well, if, because I'm beginning with possibility. But God doesn't, what is that Einstein line? God doesn't play dice, like there is no if with respect to the universal truth of a God, So I just don't have the concept of God, basically, is what, and so there could be, like, I could, in my irreligiosity and in my atheism, I basically am just like choosing to linger in unhappy consciousness for the rest of my life. Like, I'm like, the concept of God is there. I could have it. It's available to me. It's actual. And I then, quote unquote, choose not to realize it. That's the kind of move that Hegel can make there. And on a smaller scale, I think we all see this, that there are certain concepts that we just hold ourselves back from ever accepting or ever embracing, that we become very kind of siloed into our concepts and our ideas of things, and we just fail then to grasp the concept.
I like the way that you said that about like the concept of God or something like this. Like, this is like, that would almost like regress into like the sort of anxieties of epistemology that he's trying to do away with in the first development of natural consciousness. But he's saying, as he's going into self-consciousness and going more into this immanent critique of these various forms of knowledge, I think in page 129 he talks about like the ground of hope, or like the hope of becoming one with it, is like, as we dig deeper into self-consciousness, into these various modes by which we attune ourselves to the world, this is what it means to like commune with the unchangeable, or discover this sort of beyond, right? This sort of metaphysical reality or fabric of reality. It's predicated, like it's already predicated in our subjectivity or something like this,
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And there's something like at the very end of this section, he introduces the notion of a will that exists in itself, that we kind of give ourselves over to, like we no longer act with the self-certainty of the I, and instead we're acting with this third sort of mediating power, this universal that puts into practice like these new sort of motives. And I think this is sort of where, because like spirit and God kind of like come together here, where like spirit you know, and I think you could kind of do like a sort of agnostic reading of Hegel, but I don't think that's what he's endorsing here. I think he is very much like a Christian figure. And you can definitely see, right, like in kind of surrendering over to God's will, you're kind of like, that way you're in sacrificing your life for this sort of greater being, you're more free in some way, or you're giving your freedom over to a higher power.
Yep. Yep. Right. And right. So the atheist, the unhappy consciousness, the kind of troubled romantic, you know, who's always throwing themselves in despair on the ground because they just couldn't believe, that kind of thing. It, like I am insisting on my will to the end. I'll insist on my will to the end, and thus perspectively, or kind of in my point of view, I will never attain to something that's will-less. I mean, I don't think that's strictly, I agree that we could do some kind of like mediated version of that, that I take it that giving myself over to the history of philosophy and learning Hegel and learning Kant and learning Heidegger has been a kind of will-lessness.
Mm-hmm.
But the scale on which one does it, when one turns one's will over to the absolute being of a God, is just of a complete other order of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think of like, I mean, I think there are analogs here of,
Yeah.
you know, I take it that having a family and raising a child could be comparable as well, that you kind of give yourself over completely to something other than yourself and
Mm-hmm.
kind of sacrifice your will. But I think he has, well, he's just kind of coming out of seminary right now. And so you know, I think he has the kind of Christian faith in mind here.
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
Well, it's interesting too, because you know, like I'm partial to Reza Negarestani's project, and sort of his interpretation of Geist is sort of like mostly in terms of what he calls geistig intelligence, which is this sort of like impersonal sort of multi-agent sort of system that finds its being. He says the Dasein of Geist is language. And so sort of through the interaction of agents or like discursive agents on a multi-agent system, we're able to sort of generate time general ends that we are able to sort of like practically enact in our sort of socio-technical systems and in our day-to-day sort of behaviors. And so in some way, right, like there's a sense in which the development of the concept and sort of integrating our theoretical and practical cognitions could be construed in this kind of agnostic way of just like the movements of intelligence. But
Right.
I think here,
just like, yeah, networks of, yeah, like networks of communication, networks of knowledge, and decentralized ones, I think, yeah, are a modern technological analog for spirit. Though again, I think on an order of magnitude lower than Hegel imagines them here, or throughout the text, that spirit just is, you know, a kind of comprehensive network of not just cognition, but, you know, kind of comprehension. Yeah. I mean, I so, you know, last time we talked, I accused him, or put on his doorstep, the very, very real possibility of a philosophical justification for the 19th century North Atlantic slave trade. Oh well. Here I would put on his doorstep a certain, what's it called when you're against, like, you're only for one religion against all other religions, you know, kind of like, well, just kind of religious dogmatism, because there's something very important, that this is not like Hinduism. Like, Hinduism doesn't work, you know, Judaism doesn't work. It's Christianity, and it's Christianity on the assumption of Christ as the manifestation of God, you know. So it's the Trinity that's a key. So the stuff here at the end of freedom of self-consciousness, about like kind of the mediator who stands between, you know, like, so for my limited consciousness to kind of get outside of itself and access the unchangeable, is that the unchangeable, there needs to be this mediating third thing between my limited consciousness and the absolute. And that mediating third thing is, at one point in the Miller, he puts in priest, That's in paragraph 228.
Oh.
In the mediator, then, this consciousness frees itself from action and enjoyment. So far as they are regarded as its own, as a separate, independent extreme, it rejects the essence of its will. There's that language that you had, and casts upon the mediator or minister or priest its own freedom of decision, and herewith the responsibility for its own action. And so I take it, like, my knowledge of the history of religion isn't great, but I take it that priests operate on a kind of everyday way, like Christ operates more metaphysically, as the kind of like third thing that mediates between the individual soul and the absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, only Christianity on a Protestant interpretation is the kind of place where this plays out. So again, Islam, all of that, all of them are wrong, basically. Or they're not wrong. They're just kind of under realizations of this religious insight.
It's interesting you say that, because he's about to work into the chapter on reason. So he's like not talking about revealed religion, which would be like Christianity based upon the knowledge of revelation. But he's like, as he's going deeper, more imminently into this sort of fabric of nature, he sees structurally, I don't know, it seemed to me they're structurally, like, he's starting to incorporate some of that like language, but in many ways, by going deeper into these investigating deeper into these, the particular, he is making more universal claims that have, application upon, within different, traditions. But
right.
That's interesting that I know he is using some language that sounds like explicitly or uniquely Christian, but I saw it as more of a universal sort of reading that is precisely by going into the particular, he's starting to get these more universal insights.
And I'm sympathetic. I mean, I agree with PJ, and given my like unreconstructible atheism, I want to read him in a secular sense here, and so trying to think about like this structure that I think has Christian theological underpinnings here in the text. How would it translate into a more familiar epistemological or metaphysical framework that could transcend or kind of move outside of a traditional Christian setting? And so, yeah, I think kind of network analysis, like ideas of networked knowledge, or that kind of thing, is a really interesting way to read this. That there needs to be this kind of mediating third thing between the finitude of the individual self-consciousness and the absolute unchangeable truth. I mean, clearly that, I think that seems right. That I this is a silly sentence to say, but I don't understand the internet, neither do you, and how information is moving through it, and the way in which it's operating just with kind of absolute speed. And so we need this kind of we need these devices to kind of mediate our relationship to kind of new forms of networked knowledge. And that by turning ourselves over to technology, we might be, in a sense, rendering ourselves willless and thus open to and kind of other forms of cognition, computer cognition or artificial intelligence, these kind of things. And so I think there are ways to kind of take that form and move it around a little bit. But just kind of be kind of honest to the text. I take it that he has in mind here, pretty kind of strict Protestant reading of Christianity as kind of the true religion.
Right. Well, he's working into that on the basis of this dialectic between Stoicism, right, and skepticism. So Stoicism already provides a sort of image of nature that is sort of unified and has a sort of harmony in which that is accessible to reason and this sort of thing. So it would make sense that he would incorporate later Christian insights into it to reconcile it. But it's still, I don't know, I guess when I read it, I thought of it more of as a sort of universal analysis of these things. Which is Stoic insight, right? This universal reason that governs the world and is accessible by these those that give themselves to it. And so
I think, if Hegel were confronted with other religions and those systems, wouldn't he just play out the dialectic and then include that into reasoning that he already has.
Yeah, so there's that passage where he talks about, and again, it's hard not to, maybe I'll just call it racism, somewhere between like xenophobia and, just thinking like Islam is wrong and dangerous. But there's that line where he talks about like smoke or like,
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just,
217, where he talks about musical thinking.
Right. Warm incense, a musical thinking that does not get as far as the concept. I take it that this is a kind of like other forms of religion where the unchangeable, where the universal, where truth is held off in mystery, that they're kind of mystery cults or kind of mysterious practices or unnameable or unsayable. And then Christianity comes along and realizes what was always already actual in other denominations and in other faiths. It makes God like a concept or an idea, and not just an idea that's other and apart, but an idea that also became flesh. And so this is just a further realization of what was always already actual in Hinduism or in Buddhism and these kind of things. I think that would be, again, one way to read this. But again, I think there are other ways to read this stuff here too. Just on that, like we talk about this a lot, bias training, implicit bias training, prejudices, blind spots, all this language that we're using nowadays to talk about gender and race problems, though we don't talk about class problems, but anyway. I take it that Hegel's kind of got this in mind, like all of our perspectives, all of our points of view always have blind spots to them. What has to occur for us to start to realize the limitations of our perspective or the points of view that we have felt so much certainty about, that I've operated in the world with such certainty given my phenomenological perspective on reality? Something has to come along to trigger me or occasion me to open up my point of view and kind of take on another point of view. And like I take it that, like, if you're a racist, it doesn't take a ton to get you to the point where you'll start to realize the limitations of your perspective. You might double back down on them and insist on them. Or if you're, a misogynist or some kind of, transphobic person, like you'll come up against the limits of your perspective pretty quickly. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll kind of move outside of them. And so this is something we could ask of Hegel. And that is something like, if this progression is supposed to be necessary and developmental in some sense, why doesn't this always work? Why aren't limited perspectives always kind of gotten out beyond? But I take it that at the end of absolute knowing, or kind of where we're getting, is what could ever occasion a human being who is inherently finite to kind of open themselves to an infinite perspective? And one answer to that is religion, and I don't think it's the only answer. But so it does seem like there has, like, even for open-minded, consciously and conscientiously kind of open people, there's going to be a limit at some point. Like, we're going to come up against something, and nothing in my everyday experience is going to really occasion me to open myself to an infinite perspective. And so it does seem like the kind of last step to absolute knowing is the hardest to take in a certain sense, because like no kind of contradiction in my daily life, is going to show it up to me, or no kind of shortcoming or these kind of things, like I'm a misogynist and I go to Thanksgiving dinner and I say some nasty things about women, and then like every woman at the table gets up and walks away. Well, there's a good evidence that you should stop fucking being a misogynist, but like what could ever occasion you to be like, oh, well, my finite understanding of the universe, which includes the Big Bang, expansive, like all the pretty big scale stuff, what would ever occasion me to go one step further and kind of grasp like the truly absolute? And so it seems like a kind of special order of transition there at the end.
And I do kind of see what Esteban's getting at here, I think, with like Hegel kind of like reaching into some sort of universal sort of religious experience endemic to consciousness at all, where like we sort of come up against sort of the limits of the contours of our concept and our self-conception, and in doing so we necessarily have these kinds of religious experiences of the infinite. And I definitely think there's some merit in that kind of interpretation of Hegel for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious though about this, because it's been on my mind, where like certainly like Kant in some way with his like sharp delineation between reasons and causes is careful to try to not lapse back into a kind of pre-modern identity of like moral law with natural law, where there's not the sense in which, you know, the universe is maximally just, right? And I think Hegel is fairly critical of Leibniz as well, right? Like I read or in that lecture that I watched, Gabriel argues that part of the issue that Hegel has with Leibniz is similar to the issue that he has with Hume, where Leibniz, by thinking that he can understand the world entirely deductively, expands his, you know, limited, finite point of view to a sort of like universal cognition without really doing the labor to try to get there. And so I'm curious to what extent like Hegel sees the world itself as kind of imbued with sort of like moral faculties, or as like being imbued with value, because like in some way it seems as if he's arguing that like God kind of emerges from the metaphysical fabric, and that there's some kind of like identification of like moral necessity with natural necessity. And I haven't been able to tease it out of this text, and maybe it'll be more present in some of his other works, but I don't know.
You're saying that moral necessity emerges from this natural necessity? Where is it?
Yeah, or that they're identified, that they're like both sort of equal in some way.
Yeah.
I wondered if that was what some of the mutual recognition stuff was about, that like as we kind of like that there is this like in value that we ought to ascribe to the other in our movements of desire.
Yeah. I mean, I it's a good question. And I, you know, so just to kind of say something about Leibniz, you know, the principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz, like he just renames it as the principle for the best possible world. And so he just writes moral valuation into kind of he kind of stipulates moral valuation. But that's not to kind of discover, you know, like that's not to find moral valuation in the natural order. It's just to stipulate that the natural order has a moral value to it, that God created the best of all possible worlds. Then that's just like, that's Leibniz as philosopher kind of following out his logic of monadic infinitude, but then just kind of reading moral value into it. And you know, I take it that Voltaire, for all of his silliness, kind of has his hands on that in Candide, and just like, you can't just call the world morally good. You can't, you know, like you can't just come along and be like, this is morally good. You know, you'd have to argue for it. And right, so the natural law tradition gives us a model for that natural law and moral law like align with one another. And I mean, it's a good complicated question. I agree that Hegel is of the mindset that what is what's good. That metaphysical actuality and moral rightness coincide with one another. Actually, they again might not be realized as such, but he's not going to stipulate that what is right. It just has to be that what is right, and that being has a moral valuation to it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise he'd have to kind of backhand it in like Leibniz does.
And I mean, it's very obvious that he has a more nuanced view of what morality sort of entails, and like what our ethical sort of responsibilities and duties are, than Leibniz had, and than any of the sort of like ancient philosophers who would identify the universe as sort of like maximally jurisprudential, or like
Right.
So I don't know. It's just something I guess I'm gonna have to keep in my mind as I read further in, because I feel like his moral sort of stuff comes out, as we kind of get further into spirit. Because
I mean, I agree with Esteban. I think one place to think about it is in terms of the, the structure of recognition and the way in which self-consciousness always already, I just kind of keep borrowing that Derridian phrase, but I think it suits Hegel to a certain extent, always already includes kind of other consciousness, and that we cannot be selves without other selves. To help on that line, and there's something in the reading we had today about difference. I'm not sure I'll be able to find it quickly, but one of the many complaints that Hegel has against history of philosophy is that there wasn't kind of enough difference. Just to say it in some kind of like pithy meme version. It's in 204, where he reflects on difference a little bit. So, like, we can have like a little bit of commercial interlude right now. So, he describes Schelling's philosophy as a night in which all the cows are black, and like, I guess that's a funny joke in German. Like in German, it's not that funny, much funnier. But the idea was something like there's not enough difference in Schelling. Like there was too much unity, there was too much monism, there was too much homogeneity, and so applying that criticism of Schelling by Hegel to somebody like Leibniz, it's something like, if you don't have difference, real difference, determinate negation, he calls it, as an operative principle, then you're going to end up with a system that, again, the Leibnizian system, where everything's cognitively comprehensible. Like everything can just kind of be reduced to, a universal cognitive comprehension. And so insisting on difference and then seeing difference in the play of self-consciousnesses and the need for determinate negation, the need for us to be actually different from one another but kind of mutually and reciprocally in need of one another in our differences. But I think that's a place where a kind of moral valuation or axiological valuation can emerge out of a metaphysical principle of being. So I cannot be a self-conscious person without you, and you need to be like actually different from me in a determinately negative fashion. And like, so that's the ontology, that's the metaphysics. And then in that difference, we open up that's the space of axiological valuation. So I agree with Esteban that that's probably where it's going to come in, is in the kind of mutual and reciprocal play of self-consciousnesses.
Yeah, and you can kind of read it, right? Like, I feel like it's probably a fairly popular kind of reading, that part of what his story is here is kind of a Hobbesian all against all sort of at the beginning, right? When there's this sort of like life or death kind of claims when you first run up against another self-consciousness. But that it's only by sort of superseding, sort of treating the other as sort of a mere thing, that you're able to recognize yourself as morally active. And so in some way, right, like he's certainly not ascribed to this kind of pre-modern idea that morality is sort of a given within the universe or within the cosmos as a whole, but that it's something that only really has meaning or purport when it's carried out by morally like agentful actors, like it's only when we have sort of this system of recognition between agents that you can say like what even is right or wrong. So I feel like that's some aspect of spirit kind of emerging, or where morality comes into play for him.
I wonder if part of what the critique could be, or at least like maybe part of Kant's own sort of religious background as well, is sort of the problems of sort of the moral gap that emerges in Kant's moral philosophy between the categorical imperative and one's ability to actually accomplish what the dictates of reason proclaim, and so you kind of get this, as he calls it, this kind of anguish in the unhappy conscious, this kind of moral sort of self-destructiveness that sort of sees this impossibility, this impossible standard for one to meet, and so it does seem like there is this kind of critique of this kind of moral gap notion that emerges in Kant's ethics, that there's no kind of place in which recognition might actually be the area of ethics, but that if reason becomes the sort of reason, or the unchangeable or whatever becomes that which dictates morality, then you open up this possibility of just an unhappy, anguished consciousness that has no resources to accomplish the good, so that was part, as we're talking about kind of the ethical upshot of unhappy consciousness, that's sort of where my head is going.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I take it that, I mean, I like unhappy consciousness because it just describes like all of modernity. Like it's just the 20th century, like in a nutshell. Like we're all, I mean, sorry, like we're all damned to unhappy consciousness, but your way of articulating it in particularly moral, moral perspective, I think that's right, is that we know the moral law, but we feel ourselves incapable of applying it, or we know the moral imperative, but can't like hold ourselves to carrying it out. That's not a problem of morality. That's our mistake of thinking of it in the wrong way, from the wrong point of view, and from the Kantian point of view, that kind of the moral law is something out there, in this kind of quasi-natural law tradition, and that we have to kind of live up to it. But this is to get a concept wrong. Like the concept of morality isn't something other than its human actualization. It's like we wouldn't have the concept of the moral law if we didn't already have it, in a sense, to sound a little bit tautological there. Yeah. Esteban, I know, has questions about freedom, and another way to articulate this question is just kind of like that it's that the problem is freedom, and so it's not something that we said explicitly, but the end of this chapter is the freedom of self-consciousness, and he writes that quite explicitly at the beginning, that it's in paragraph 200, I think, is the first time no, it's actually a little even before that. So right from the beginning, 197 through 200, where we start getting language of freedom. And so here too, this would be the idea that Kant gives us the notion of negative freedom, like we're kind of free from constraint, but Hegel, if we only linger in freedom, like we can free ourselves from the constraint of, just kind of use this Kantian Freudian thing of like, I wish I could be, I wish I could be a celibate and wait for marriage to have sex, but I just can't do that. This kind of, so I kind of feel myself to be free every time I resist the temptation of having premarital sex. That's basically the model of freedom that the tradition gave us, according to Hegel. And what Hegel's wanting to give us is a positive notion of freedom, where we make ourselves, like we enact our freedom by way of the moral law that we ourselves don't like dictate to the world, but that we actualize, or that we realize in the world. And so it's a robust notion of freedom that Hegel thinks the tradition is not, enabled.
Yeah, there's some, and there's an interesting sense, right, where like for Hegel and Kant, like our spontaneity is a sort of crucial aspect of, okay, bye, Chris.
Bye, Chris.
Our spontaneity is kind of a crucial aspect of our cognition, as being able to come to terms with the world and gradually know the world.
Right.
But it's also how we have sort of freedom from being determined by heteronymous causes. Like we have autonomous reasons for doing things, and that's one of the ways that we're set apart as moral agents and as practical doers. But I think it's interesting here, where it seems like Hegel is almost saying that a constitutive element of our freedom is that we are in some way determined that we do have shackles, but that we can break them, and that we can, in breaking them, sort of set new constraints. And so like rather than being sort of like merely, or like having this domain that's completely unconditioned, that's totally autonomous, he's saying that like there are constraints all the way up, but that freedom consists in sort of determinately negating these previous situations, and being able to sort of preserve aspects of their truth, and suspend them in order to sort of create a more just society, or what have you. Yeah.
This is why Stoicism and skepticism for him are such failures, because they're both free, but they're indeterminately free, to kind of just use his language, because you can be as free as you want in thought, or in this kind of pure intentionality of a domain outside of agency or practical realization. And that's what the Stoics and the skeptics, well, the Stoics were kind of like the positive version of that, and then the skeptics were kind of the negative version of that. But that's not freedom in any kind of human form, or in any real sense of freedom. That freedom has to be realized, and he gets that from Kant, but he kind of holds Kant, I don't know, he just pushes Kant to like stay truer to the form. But I mean, so one question I have is like, so I take it that desire leads to freedom, because we don't have, like, I'm always interested in, for lack of a better word, the affective quality of the state of consciousness that we're in, or the like motor force in the state of consciousness we're in. So before this, we had desire. Like, he introduces desire in Lordship and Bondage. And last time when we talked with one another, we said that the structure of desire had a certain lack to it, and that makes sense of the Lordship and Bondage section. But then I take it that like the want for freedom, or the desire for freedom, is now the motor impulse here at the end of self-consciousness. But I wonder is like, if freedom is the later development of desire, and desire has this lack structure to it, then I wonder about a robust model of positive freedom. If that make, like, if I'm kind of articulating a thought that's still at stewing for me. It's something, like, I take it that I agree with the conversation we had last time, that the best way to understand desire in the Lordship and Bondage section is a kind of lack, and that one self-consciousness, quote unquote, needs another self-consciousness, and so on and so forth. But if that's the motor impulse behind that leads us to freedom, then wouldn't freedom have the same kind of lack structure? And so aren't we back with, I'm free when I'm resisting temptation, that kind of like quasi-Christian thing of like, don't covet thy neighbor's wife, and these kind of things. And so that doesn't give us necessarily a new model of positive freedom, if it's not this kind of like freedom that's overflowing, or freedom that's like overabundant, or something like this. So on my reading, I'd like to kind of link freedom to this infinitude stuff more than freedom to the desire stuff, because then it's, I just feel the constraints. I agree with you, PJ. I just come up against constraints against my freedom, and I know my spontaneity is so much bigger than the spontaneity of like not having another Oreo cookie or something. Like, that kind of Stoic, and Kant was very influenced by the Stoics, that kind of Stoic, like celebrating your freedom for every time you don't do something. That doesn't give us a new moral order, a new political order, like what Hegel's notion of freedom kind of starts, works us towards.
And I do think, oh, go ahead, Esteban, please.
On page 122, he does talk about linking the notion of freedom not to, what is you, I forgot what we were linking, not to desire, but to thought. He thinks that, like, like he talks about, for the essence of freedom, right at the top there, for the essence of that freedom is at first only thinking in general, the form of thought, which has turned away from the independence of things and returned into itself. So like, that's the content, like that's helpful. I don't know, like the infinite, like sort of thought grounded, like, I don't know, like thought is like that sort of domain of the infinite, I guess.
Right.
Yeah,
And
and
that's the content that's able to fill that out, right? Without it being like too overdeterminate and restraining.
That's helpful. And that's the Stoic move, right? Is that kind of like you know, on one version of, you know, early Christian thought is something like, you know, there are these slaves, their lived circumstances are miserable, you know, brutish, miserable, and nasty and short, thankfully short, you know, so they're free in their minds. They sit in enslavement, but they're free in their minds because nothing that the Roman Empire does to them can ever stop them from thinking that they live in the revealed and right religion. So that's helpful. So that means that thought has a certain appetitiveness to it, that thought's driving the process forward, and it's not merely like, maybe I'm thinking too, what was that, faculty sack, you know, that like, you know, I think of cognition as one kind of thing, and then appetitiveness is another kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
we're seeing thought.
Oh,
Yeah.
desire and thought, I totally like cooperating here in Hegel's
Yep.
model in my mind. And so like this sort of incessant desire to take the world and work with it is not incompatible with this more abstract notion of thinking.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's this tendency when we're talking about morality, and I think it's in Kant as well, where it's sort of the idea that we're denying the sort of base animal part of ourselves. You know, like we're, as like morally free agents, we aren't merely determined by, you know, our instinct. And I think that that is an important sort of like marker of our ability to follow rules, for example, right? Because if you are merely following instincts, you wouldn't be able to choose between multiple sort of like possibilities or states of affairs or whatever. But then, and I think you get this right, Esteban, that it's like the sort of like thought as the domain where like we can have serious sort of like ambitious kind of projects for our morality, right? Like it's where we're able to posit these new worlds and say like, you know, like try to approach these new or appropriately like sort of structured societies.
Right. But by keeping the appetitive and the cognitive tethered to one another, combined with one another, it doesn't become pure speculation in the Kantian sense. We're not kind of merely like sitting and pondering what, you know, democratic equality looks like. In our thought of democratic equality, we are in some sense agentially and productively working towards it in the thought of it. So to think and to do for Hegel have to remain closely connected with one another in a way that really for the history of philosophy we haven't seen. Like there aren't a lot of models for that in the history of philosophy. But again, I take that this goes back to his reworking of the very notion of a concept, that a concept isn't a kind of private possession, you know, or some kind of like, you know, I have it and I need to get out of it, or I got it from somewhere. But the very like that is his cognitive ontology is just very different than really the history of philosophy.
He definitely doesn't. And Kant gets away from this too, sort of, but getting away from the idea that like we would just receive concepts from experience, right? Like he criticizes that throughout his work, right? I think in the lecture I watched, he said that one of Hegel's sort of main targets in the phenomenology is this Bewusstseinsphilosophy, which is like cognition or consciousness philosophy, I think is what it translates to. And it's sort of that sort of basic idea that we're like receiving concepts in some way from reality.
One way to, I think, articulate this, and I have to pull away here a little bit early tonight. So one way to think about this is that everyone in the history of philosophy has faced a problem that Hegel doesn't know. I think to some extent Kant doesn't either, but not fully. And that is something like, there's always a question of the instantiation of a concept or the particularization of the universal. Like if you take an ancient philosophy class, that's like one of the long-standing questions in the history of philosophy is like, what is the relationship between the universal and the particular? And then when we get into the modern tradition, we get the question of kind of like, are our concepts realized in the world? You know, like, are concepts innate? Do they apply to the world? We got them from the world, so how could they ever be universal? These kind of things. And in Hegel, by changing the notion of a concept, just none of those questions matter anymore. Every concept is universal and particular, and every concept is instantiated, and everything is an instance of a concept. There's not like, it's a kind of brilliant and simple answer to long-standing seeming questions in the history of philosophy. Just that we like kind of started from the wrong standpoint. And I take it that the phenomenology is a kind of education of a re-education of the history of philosophy in all the wrong starting points. Like you started the wrong place, so of course you ended up in a cul-de-sac. Like of course you ended up feeling like, you know, the world was unknowable or that the moral law was unrealizable, but you just started the wrong place. Like you didn't have the right perspective. And, you know, again, I think this language has some analogy to today, is that like if you begin from a white supremacist standpoint, then something like, you know, equal representation of racial minorities seems like a problem. Well, you don't have to start from a perspective of white supremacy. Like that which seems like a problem probably is just built in the perspective from which you're articulating it as a problem, you know. So I think there's something really transformative in that Hegelian insight.
And I wanted to say one last thing about desire, because, you know, like he is very clear about how desire is central to self-consciousness, right? Like he says, you know, self-consciousness is desire. But he, in the master-slave dialectic, he talks about how desire starts off wanting nature, or the living sort of organic nature, which has turned in on itself and is thus sort of like this infinite process. But that he sort of says that the sort of culmination of life as this process is self-sufficiency. And the highest expression of self-sufficiency is thought. And so what desire ultimately ends up wanting is thought, and is being able to determine its own ends. And so I think that's how he gets from, you know, he says like, yeah, like we are sort of like desire does kind of link us up with animals, but ultimately, like as the kinds of natural consciousness that we do have, like we are able to desire sort of being undetermined by other causes. So I think that's how
it's helpful. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, I need to wander away here. Do we want to read a little bit of Reason? I just thought maybe we could take the last. I mean, you guys can keep talking. I just have to. Do you want to read a little bit of Reason?
Yeah, I think that'd be good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Reason.
So just start on Reason.
Yeah, that's
Observing reason.
See how far we get.
Yeah, we could just read a little bit just to get some of that language. I like. I don't remember if it was PJ or Chris's suggestion, or Esteban, I forget. I'm sorry. Whoever suggested it, I like the idea of skipping all the way ahead and reading Absolute Knowing also. I think that makes sense. So maybe we could read a little bit of Reason and then skip all the way ahead, read the kind of end, and then maybe go back and read the preface.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good plan.
That's great.
Good to talk with you all, and yeah, have a good afternoon.
Yeah.
See you, Pete. See you guys.